Welcome back to Tiny Blue Games. My name is of course Csaw or Chris, and today we have a new MMORPG comparison video. That's right, I finally got around to making some more comparison videos. In today's video, we are comparing the upcoming MMORPG, New World, to some of the largest MMOs on the market. These games include World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy XIV, The Elder Scrolls Online, and Guild Wars 2. Now, these games have certainly not been chosen because they're the most similar to New World, but rather I see a lot of people from these communities that are curious about New World and what the game has to offer. Like in previous videos, we will be using several different comparison points to examine each of these titles, including scope, combat progression, PvP or PVE content, and of course, value. The last thing I should mention before we begin is that I am a Guild Wars 2 or ArenaNet partner. Does this mean I'll say nothing bad about Guild Wars 2? No, you'll see the good, you'll see the bad, and you will see everything in between, but it does mean there are 2 sponsored links in the description below that will help with the channel if you use them. Lastly, please consider taking the time to like and subscribe if you enjoy this type of content, and be sure to share your own thoughts about these games in the comments section below. With all that said, let's dive into the comparison. We're going to start the comparison with scope, which I define as what kind of game is it. It should be noted that we will be staying fairly high level for this comparison as we are comparing multiple titles at the same time. In the future, I do plan to do some more one-on-one comparisons that will allow us to get more into the nitty and gritty. To start things off, we'll be taking a look at New World. Scope is probably one of the most important talking points for New World, as I feel like this will really help people to understand if this game is in fact trying to appeal to them. It's also particularly interesting as the scope of New World has changed fairly significantly over its development. The game started with a very heavy focus on open world PvP, leaning into full loot deaths and other more hardcore PvP mechanics. Since then, the game has toned down the hardcore PvP aspects, allowing players to flag for open world PvP, and presenting itself as having a mix of both PvP and PvE content. So how would I sum up New World's current scope then? Well, in one word, it would be exploration. You were exploring and trying to discover the secrets of a new land, gathering resources, fighting wild creatures and other adventurers, and ultimately working together with other players of your faction or company. With this comes a lot of freedom to enjoy the game in your own way. For instance, do you like to run around chopping trees and singing to yourself? Well, Amazon's got you covered. Moving on to World of Warcraft, we can definitely say this is another game where the scope has changed over time. And to be clear, for the purpose of this video, we're primarily talking about Retail WoW. A game that used to be focused on exploration and community is now focused on instance content and time-gated grinds. Now, to be clear, both of these elements have been in the game for a long time, but the amount of systems dedicated to propping up this type of gameplay has almost drowned out any sense of exploration and discovery in the current game. At its heart, WoW is of course a theme park MMO and has a little bit of something for everyone. The difficulty with this is some of these little somethings are done much better than others. Interested in raids? Great, we get one during most major content patches. Interested in battlegrounds? Too bad, we didn't even get one during the expansion that was almost entirely focused on the Horde versus Alliance war. It's a system that works really well when content and development is flowing properly, but it works less well when there are large droughts for certain game modes, with essentially no end to the drought in sight. Final Fantasy XIV is often described as an RPG MMO as opposed to an MMORPG, and I don't think there's any better way of putting it. Yes, it's a theme park MMO that tries to scratch everyone's itch with a different game mode like dungeons, raids, PvP, but it leans way more into the story than most MMOs on this list. The easiest way to understand this is that completing the main scenario quest is often a better sign of progression than a character's actual level. This can be a little bit strange or even irritating for people who come from other MMOs and just want to hit max level because that's when MMOs actually are supposed to begin, yada yada yada, but if you take the time to enjoy the story and progression together, the payoff is huge and continues to deliver in new content as it's released. I like to think of the Elder Scrolls Online as a jack of all trades. Exploration, story, and quests are all a big part of the game, just like in Guild Wars 2 and Final Fantasy XIV. However, there is a significant amount of new dungeons and raids added like WoW and Final Fantasy XIV as well. At its heart, ESO is part of the Elder Scrolls universe, and a lot of the story content is obviously driven by that lore. There are also a lot of zone-specific storylines and lore pieces to collect, which feels similar to the way lore is presented in New World. Ultimately, exploration is a big part of ESO, but I feel like it dives deeper into endgame content than both New World and Guild Wars 2 do in their current iterations. Guild Wars 2 is often said to be an MMO designed for casuals with an endgame focused on fashion. Well, that's all true, and trust me, this is actually a big compliment. The game respects your time and actually feels fun to play, which I know is pretty strange for MMO players. New content is primarily focused on introducing new maps to explore, story missions to play through, and armor skins to collect. It's the perfect game to play every so often without feeling like you're completely out of the loop. Sounds perfect, right? Well, almost. The one issue you might face is if you choose to make PvP or PvE endgame your primary focus. Although these types of content are still being updated, it can really be a long time without any major changes, and is an issue that continues to shrink the player base in these game modes. Next, we'll be talking about combat, how you squish things or how you end up getting squished. New World is fairly distinct here. With no classes and the ability to swap between weapons fairly easily, you have a significant amount of freedom. I do think that the lack of classes does remove some of the fantasy identity you experience in the other titles, but it allows for some truly unique character customization. Want to wield a musket and an ice gauntlet? You've got it. Want to fight close range with a spear and then snipe people from afar with a bow? You've got it. There's a lot of options to combine and something for everyone. The combat itself is by far the most action-y out of all the titles on the list, if that makes sense, with more weight and animation lock than either ESO or Guild Wars 2 has. This combat works especially well for small skill encounters such as duels or hunting creatures in the wild, but can feel a bit more clunky in larger wars or group dungeons. The real standout for me is the musket gameplay, as it truly feels like playing a first-person shooter while you're in an MMO, and I think it's really unique and fun. In terms of player roles, there is a light Holy Trinity system, with the life staff allowing for healing builds and several different weapons having taunt options for tanks. In stark contrast, we have WoW. With a tap targeting combat system and a well-established Holy Trinity role system, WoW probably feels the most different from New World of any of the games on this list. Classes have several different specs, which at this point almost feel entirely like different classes from one another, and there are a significant number of tank and healing options, allowing for most playstyles to be accommodated. Proficiency is achieved by mastering class-specific rotations to dish out as much damage, or DPS if you prefer, as possible. This is important for both healers and tanks as well, as most content is focused on killing creatures as quickly as possible. Final Fantasy XIV also has a tab targeting system with traditional Holy Trinity roles, though admittedly there are some more support or hybrid specs or jobs in this situation than other titles. The combat has a longer global cooldown compared to World of Warcraft, which makes the combat feel a bit slower, especially early on in the game. Proficiency is achieved by mastering rotations and working skills that are off the global cooldown in between skills that are on the global cooldown. I find the slower combat can feel tedious at certain points, but it does make larger skills feel more impactful. Additionally, there are limit break abilities which are used by one member of the party or raid to do a huge attack or defensive effect. It's a very cool way of making combat feel more team focused and certainly allows for more strategic decision making when using those specific skills. Similarly to WoW, this combat is very different than anything you will see in New World, so keep that in mind. ESO has action combat with a light Holy Trinity system. I say light because there are certain classes and weapons that are better for tanking and healing, and you technically queue in for random dungeons with a specific rule in mind. However, it isn't likely that every enemy will be aggroed to a tank at all times, and other party members should be more aware of tanking and healing than in either WoW or Final Fantasy XIV. Similarly to New World, weapons have light and heavy attacks. This is activated by using your mouse. However, unlike New World, you have access to 2 action bars worth of abilities that you can easily swap between in combat. Proficiency comes from rotating through cooldowns to keep buffs and debuffs active, and oftentimes includes animation cancelling to sneak in light attacks between your stronger abilities. This is the part of the combat that most people don't like, as it keeps many classes in a constant state of animation spasms. Additionally, a lot of animations kind of feel floaty, as they can be freely classed whenever. This is convenient, but makes powerful abilities feel less impactful. Ultimately, I would say ESO's combat is probably the closest to New World's, but a step more forgiving and less impactful. Guild Wars 2 has a mix of action combat and tab targeting, with the lightest version of the Holy Trinity of any of these titles. The reason I say it's the lightest of the Holy Trinities is that Guild Wars 2 lacks true aggro holding abilities outside of specific encounters. A big focus is put on support roles in Guild Wars 2, and specifically keeping up very strong buffs like quickness, might, and alercity. Each class, or profession as they say in the game, combines 3 specs to build their character. Later expansions introduce elite specs, giving professions new and unique abilities that are distinct from the base profession. Elite specializations feel more similar to specs in WoW, or even distinct jobs like in Final Fantasy XIV. Proficiency in combat comes from mastering DPS rotations and keeping all boons on yourself, or others if you're playing a support role. The combat is perhaps less intense for small-scale fights compared to New World, but I feel like it does a better job of scaling up for larger battles. This brings us to progression, the way the game makes you feel more powerful over time. Now, New World is a little bit tricky here because we don't know what future major updates or expansions will bring. Will the level cap be increased? Will better items be introduced at max level? There are some unanswered questions for sure. However, from what we have seen, there will be a fair bit of vertical progression upon release. Players gain levels which award attribute points, weapons gain levels of mastery, and gear grows in rarity and power through a clearly defined gear score system. What's interesting about New World is the lack of classes and the ability to have all weapons mastered on one character, making the game feel similar to Final Fantasy XIV. You don't need an army of alts and can change your playstyle up significantly later on in the game. In addition to all of this, crafting will likely be more important than it is in a lot of these other games, as being able to turn valuable resources into power will be a significant benefit in all stages of the game. World of Warcraft has one of the most vertical forms of progression around, where not only is most gear useless from past expansions, but gear often gets outclassed even between major patches. The power between someone that is max level 60 in this case, and someone who is still level 50 from the end of BFA is absolutely massive. On top of all this, we can't forget the lovely endgame progression systems that for some reason seem to need to be reinvented every single expansion. This time, we're dealing with things such as covenants, conduits, legendaries. Yeah, it's just a bunch of fun. In terms of similarities to New World, I find the fact that both games are very explicit, with item level and gear score very similar, and this is why I think we can expect a fair bit of vertical progression from New World. Final Fantasy XIV has vertical progression similar to WoW's, though it lacks many of the additional tedious endgame systems that Blizzard loves to sprinkle on top. The game has gear that gets better with newer, more difficult content, and a level cap that increases with each expansion. The major shift in verticality here is the ability to level all of your jobs on the same character. So instead of having to make an alt and start from scratch to play something else, you simply change job and level up on the side. This is similar to the idea of only having one character and mastering multiple weapons in New World, allowing players to change the pace of their gameplay whenever they like. ESO is a fairly large step removed from the previous 3 games in this list, with a horizontal progression system and a static level cap. This means that a character that was max level for a previous expansion a couple years ago would still be max level for the newest expansion now. In terms of gear, a lot of player power comes from specific sets or combinations of different sets attached to specific items. The best sets do change and typically favor some of the newer release sets when new expansions do come out, so this kind of forces players to have to go and find new sets and re-min-max their characters. However, there are some sets that seem to always have a place within the meta. There are also some additional skills that can be unlocked through various guilds that grant your character more powerful abilities. These need to be unlocked on a per character basis and can be something you have to do over again when making an alt. Additionally, there is a talent tree-like system called champion points that awards players power even after they've hit max level. In my mind, Guild Wars 2 is easily the most horizontal of all the progression systems we've examined so far. Level cap remains at level 80 for each expansion, and Ascended Gear still provides the best stats in the game, though you can upgrade to legendary items to progress your Fashion Wars gameplay if you prefer. There are some runes and sigils that kind of act like set bonuses from ESO that could become stronger or weaker as expansions are released. These shifts in the meta can push people to need to gear up a bit, but it's fairly minimal. There is a mastery system that grants players power after max level, but unlike ESO, this power is typically limited to new ways of interacting with the world as opposed to any kind of player power. In this case, it would be things like gliding, or using your mount differently, or even bouncing on mushrooms. This system is also account-wide, allowing your alts to enjoy many of the perks your main character does as well. And now it's time to look at some of the types of content we'll find in these games. We'll start with the PvE game modes and then move into the PvP. As stated before, I will try and keep this list of content fairly light, as we could take forever examining every piece of content possible in these games. As with the previous sections, we'll start with New World, and I would say PvE content isn't exactly the game's strong suit. Now, don't get me wrong, the game is in a much better place for PvE content than it was a year ago during the initial beta, but compared to these other titles, it's got a ways to go. Some of the PvE offerings include dungeons, or expeditions as they call them. These are 5-player instances that usually include 2 bosses and a bunch of trash or puzzle mechanics. Now, these do require keys to activate them, and you either get these through specific story quests for the expeditions themselves, or they can be crafted from different resources. So there's kind of a finite amount of entries into them, but with everyone having these quests in their stories and the actual resources being pretty easy to obtain to make the keys, there's usually quite a few instances going on, so it's not too much of a concern. In terms of open world, we have things such as quests, bosses, and corrupted breaches, which are very similar to rifts from the game Rift, where you'll have kind of a tear in the universe where a bunch of corrupted creatures come out and you kind of face a few different waves of them, and there's often a boss, and when you defeat that, you use your Azov staff and then you kind of seal the breach, and it's as if nothing was there in the end. So it's a pretty cool thing to do. You can either do them solo in some instances, or there are some more group oriented ones, and you'll have a train of people go from breach to breach kind of sealing them, which is a pretty cool way to grind some stuff out. Finally, we also have something called invasions, and these are kind of like tower defense games where you and your allies sort of put defenses around a fort, and then there's waves of corrupted creatures that come and try and take the fort from you. I unfortunately didn't reach max level, which I believe you have to be to do this in the beta event and in live game as well, so I don't have any footage of this, but it sounds pretty cool, and I did watch some videos, and I think it's a really interesting piece of endgame content. Where New World is a bit light on PvE content, WoW typically has a lot. For example, some of the PvE content that we have in this expansion includes things such as campaign quests or daily quests, dungeons, which includes the Mythic Plus system, which is kind of a ever-scaling level of difficulty that applies to most endgame dungeons, as well as mega dungeons, which are kind of a cross between raids and dungeons and eventually turns into mega dungeons. I'm kind of confused by their place actually, but they are there. Dungeons are probably the most similar piece of content to New World, but they're quite different in World of Warcraft versus New World, where you have a very specific meta. Everyone's focused on rushing through them, specifically with Mythic Plus that does have a timer. So there's a little bit less exploration, and it's more about perfection in terms of rotation and comp and stuff like that, whereas New World would be more focused on exploring and solving puzzles and kind of taking your time as well. Raids, on the other hand, are quite distinct to World of Warcraft. We have 10 to 30 player raids for both normal and heroic mode, as well as mythic raids, which are 20-man raids, and Torghast, which I actually forgot when making this list. I was like, I guess Torghast technically is content, despite the fact that everyone hates it. But yeah, so those are the main activities for Shadowlands. There's a ton of other content that you could dive into, but we're just gonna keep it at those core activities for WoW. Final Fantasy XIV also has a significant amount of PvE content. One of the big things is this story, which in this case is called the main scenario quest. You, unlike World of Warcraft, actually have to go through the quests of each of the previous expansions to enjoy the newest content in the newest Shadowlands expansion, or perhaps later on when this video is being watched in the Endwalker expansion, which is really cool. It's kind of tedious than some people who are used to World of Warcraft and just trying to get to end game, but it is nice because it does set you up to really enjoy end game content and understand the actual story elements that are being talked about in a lot of the different activities. Otherwise, we have things such as dungeons. Once again, these are probably the most similar to New World. The big difference here is that you have 4 players in these dungeons as opposed to 5. They are also more focused on very specific Holy Trinity roles. There's less of this time-sensitive thing that you would have with the Mythic Plus system, so they're maybe a little bit more comparable that way. We also have trials, which are like 8-man raids of a single boss. We have alliance raids, which are raids with 24 players. We have deep dungeons, which are kind of ever going. It's kind of like Torghast, but actually fun is how I'd put it. It's a dungeon that keeps going in terms of levels of difficulty. There's some very specific mechanics to it as well, and I'll be the first to say I haven't done deep dungeons enough to give a great summary of them, but they are quite unique to Final Fantasy XIV, and I think they're a bunch of fun. Otherwise, there's a ton of open world stuff to do in terms of beast tribes and different quests and collections to go and complete. Which brings us to the Elder Scrolls Online, which perhaps has less PvE content than World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV, but certainly has more than New World, and I would say it has more consistent PvE content than Guild Wars 2 as well. In terms of the types of content, we have quests and story content. Obviously, being an Elder Scrolls game, you have a lot of story that's steeped in the Elder Scrolls lore, but one of the best parts of this MMO is that all of the quests, or at least most of the quests, are fully voice acted and feel very professional, and it is really immersive when you go into new zones and take part in the different stories that are happening there. Otherwise, we do have dungeons. There are a variety of difficulty here. We have normal and veteran, I believe it's what it's called in this game, which are kind of the harder mode. And then you also have DLC veteran dungeons, which are even a bit more difficult and unique in terms of their mechanics as well. In terms of the dungeon itself, this is once again a 4-player dungeon with more of a light Trinity system, as we discussed earlier, but you do actually queue in as either a tank, a healer, or DPS. Then you have 10-player raids, which I think there's usually one for each expansion, which usually comes out every year. So there's a significant flow of raids that come out there, once again adhering to a light Trinity system where there are tanks tanking the creatures and support roles that are dealing out more heals and support spells. And then lastly, you have the Maelstrom Arena, which is once again more of a arena-based wave of creatures kind of scenario. Lastly, we have Guild Wars 2, which I would say has more PvE content than New World, but is probably the most similar out of all of the different games here, with the least amount of overall PvE content in terms of consistent development. Looking at the specific types of content we have dungeons, fractals, raids, strike missions, dragon response missions. It sounds like a lot, but a lot of these have actually kind of been discontinued, and sort of transitioned into a newer version of itself. For instance, dungeons were there at launch, but have transitioned into fractals, which is kind of their new version of dungeons. Not to say you can't do the previous dungeon version, but fractals are definitely the new type of content that you will get in terms of progressing into the future. Similarly, raids were launched with Heart of Thorns and have now transitioned into strike missions. It hasn't been officially stated, but that's pretty much what's happened. And I sound upset about it because I do enjoy those previous types of content, but it's actually smart that they have stayed with one type of content and have really kind of put their development resources into creating more of that type. Lastly, you have things such as exploration, collections, and of course, Guild Wars 2 wouldn't be Guild Wars 2 without jumping puzzles. Next, we'll take a look at some of the PvP content these games have to offer. Unlike PvE, New World was built with PvP in mind and has a significant amount of PvP content available for its release. Outpost Rush is a 20 vs 20 man Fort War style gameplay. It's instanced and feels very similar to Battlegrounds and some of the other games we will have on this list. They also have wars, which are 50 vs 50 person territory wars. There are a few issues with this that were felt during beta and have kind of been present in the game for a long time, but it's very difficult to actually get chosen to be in these wars. It's often up to the actual companies that are declaring war, which makes a lot of sense, but can be quite difficult in terms of accessibility for your average player. It makes me think a lot of the war plot system in WildStar. If you remember way back when, war plots were these super awesome 40 vs 40 battleground style things where you actually built them out with all these specific housing features that would be like traps and stuff like that. It was epic, but did I ever do one? No, because it was so hard to find a guild that was doing it, and by the time people had the resources to do it, people were leaving the game. I mean, there was other issues there, but it makes me think of those types of systems where it sounds awesome, you see other people's enjoying them on YouTube and stuff like that, but you never get to experience it yourself. Otherwise, there's of course open world flagged PvP or PvP Covenant quests, and I think this has the best potential for PvP content in the game because I think that the combat system works so well at a small scale. Whenever I'm fighting someone and it's like a duel or it's just like a 1v1 out in the wilderness, that's when the game shines the best. And with that in mind, New World needs arenas. They need an arena system that you queue into, and it's either 1v1, 2v2, 3v3, and it would be so much fun. It would make the game shine so bright, especially if you could do it pretty early on in the game, say like level 10, once you have a Covenant, tie it to your Covenant, rep or whatever. I think it would be such a great system for the game, and it would really promote people trying out PvP content pretty early on. Which brings us to World of Warcraft, which does in fact have arenas. We have ranked or non-ranked arenas, we have 2s or we have 3s ranked arenas, and for all of the issues with the arena system in terms of balance and weird comps and stuff like that, I'd say WoW's arena system is still by far the best version of arenas in any MMO on this list, and probably any MMO I can think of. And it's such a strange thing because I think arenas at their heart are such an easy thing for an MMO to do. All you're doing is a team deathmatch in a small arena. It doesn't sound too hard. The issue is it puts balance on such a pedestal. It's going to become super clear what classes are unbalanced, and if you have any issues with that, it's going to really balloon pretty quickly. And it's definitely something that WoW faces, but I think it's great that they do it because it is a lot of fun to play. Otherwise, we have things such as Battlegrounds. Once again, there's skirmish versions of Battlegrounds. There's epic versions of Battlegrounds now, which are kind of the longer format ones, such as Archeric Valley or Wintergrasp. So those are separated from the shorter versions, such as Warson Gulch, which is the flag capture ones, as well as conquest style battlegrounds as well. And then there's also rated battlegrounds, which takes those shorter versions and allows you to actually gather rating and rated gear from them. In addition to all this, you have open world PvP through the new war mode. I wouldn't say war mode's anything game-changing, it's just a toggle for open world PvP. It feels very similar to what the flagged system in New World is going to be. What is nice is that based on the faction imbalance, you actually get a bigger percentage for flagging for PvP. I think there's a lot of incentive work they could do for New World to make it more worth people's while to actually be flagged for PvP. You know, apart from actually having to do specific PvP Covenant quests and have PvP flagged for that, I feel very little incentive to have it on. There are some advantages in terms of actually leveling or mastering different weapons from PvP kills and stuff like that, but the amount of people I have seen in the open world with the PvP flag on is pretty discouraging, and I think there needs to be more done to encourage people to flip that on in a new world. Final Fantasy XIV also has arenas in the form of the Wolf's Den. These are, I think, 5 versus 5 arenas, though I could be getting that wrong, so don't take my word for that. But the big thing that stands out with Final Fantasy XIV PvP is that you actually do get a different version of your job or class, if you prefer, when entering into PvP mode. And this kind of strips away some of the imbalance that you would expect in other games, but does make the class feel a little bit less impactful than it does in PvE. Some people really enjoy it, some people really dislike it. I think it takes a little bit of getting used to, certainly when you're starting the game. Otherwise, you have frontline PvP, which is a form of battleground. This is where you can kind of face off against 2 other teams and either do conquest-style gameplay or different objectives like that, as well as Rival Wings, which is kind of a MOBA-esque style of PvP with different lanes. Once again, it plays very similar to a battleground where you do queue in and you're in an instance area, but it does have a very different feel to the game mode with like different PvE elements mixed in as well. Next, we have the Elder Scrolls Online, which also has battlegrounds that features 3 teams facing off against each other. The big difference here is that they are much smaller teams with 4 players apiece. This is excellent because, as I've said earlier in this video, I think action combat really shines when there are smaller scale PvP battles. You can really dodge specific mechanics and really launch bigger attacks on specific players that you're trying to kill, instead of just having a blurry mess of things that you can't really dodge. Speaking of a mess of things, we also have Cyrodiil, which is the large-scale war combat or world versus world variant for the Elder Scrolls Online. Now, this is a pretty cool game mode, and it does feel very epic when you're riding around and seeing the different armies facing off against each other, but it is a game mode that does suffer from lag, and whenever there's lag in PvP, it can be not so fun. So it really depends on the day you queue in. Obviously, your computer impacts things as well. I'm sure some people had no issues, but I've had my fair share of issues when queuing in as well. So it's a bit of a hit or miss, but it's nice that it is an option for people who do love that large-scale PvP battle. Which finally brings us to Guild Wars 2. Now, much like the PVE content in Guild Wars 2, I'd say that the amount of changes and development that goes into SPVP, or World versus World, is pretty minimal compared to new maps and story content. That being said, these game modes do see changes from time to time, and it is nice to see when it does happen. SPVP is essentially your battlegrounds. There are primarily conquest maps. There was this other map that they did that was very similar to a MOBA, and I can't even remember the name of it right now, but they launched it at the start of Heart of Thorns and have not done anything with it since then, so I'm willing to say it's one of those things that have been discontinued, as we talked about in the PvE area. In terms of SPVP, there has been new maps added, and there have also been different modes. They do have sort of 2v2 arenas or 3v3 arenas from time to time now, which is great to see. It falls in line with my idea that the smaller the scale of PvP, the more impactful the PvP feels with action combat, and that definitely feels true for Guild Wars 2 as well. Now, they do have a world versus world game mode. I'd say this is probably one of the best versions of a large-scale war combat system. There are some issues, specifically with certain classes feeling very powerful when attacking, and there's often very much zergy gameplay that you see, which I think no matter what game you play is pretty typical of large-scale combat, but there are various objectives that you can win with either, small groups of players, which does make it feel very impactful, even as kind of a lone wolf scenario. Overall, I think it's a really fun game mode, and the addition of a mount to the game mode has done a lot to make it be enjoyed as well. Finally, we'll talk about value, which I define as the content received minus the price. This segment is possibly one of the more difficult comparisons for New World, as we don't really know what the future will bring. We know that the game is buy to play and at a reasonable price point. We know it doesn't have a sub fee, and we know that there's going to be a cash shop. There have been rumors, and I would assume that the game would use an expansion model for future monetization if the initial release is a success. On the surface, this is a great model. It's very similar to the Guild Wars 2 model, which for me is the gold standard for value, if nothing else. The real question mark here is the cash shop. We have already heard some discussion about convenience-based items, and the line between convenience and pay to win is always pretty murky. That said, the developers were quick to hear the concerns surrounding convenience items in the cash shop, so hopefully they will continue to be mindful as new items are introduced. Ultimately, New World is a ton of content for the buy-to-play price. Even if you bought the game and only leveled one character to max level, you'd probably feel like you got your money's worth out of the game. In my mind, that's a pretty safe bet. Oof. That's the sound I think of when people ask me to describe the value of World of Warcraft. In a perfect world, and in some of the previous expansions, World of Warcraft is an expensive game where you pay for the newest expansion as well as the sub fee to receive a consistent stream of high quality content. In today's world, WoW is an expensive game where you pay for the newest expansion as well as the sub fee to receive a very small, irregular amount of okayish quality content. On top of that, there is a lovely WoW token. In theory, this is a system that allows some players to use in-game gold to pay for their sub, and allows players with less time to play to use real-life money for in-game resources. In reality, it's a system that helps promote pay-to-win gameplay with boosting for many types of endgame content. At this point in time, I am inclined to say WoW is the worst value MMORPG on this list, and consider it a very hard sell when explaining the appeal to new players. Final Fantasy XIV is essentially the WoW submodel, but actually working properly. It's priced as a premium game with a sub fee, but delivers a premium level of content. It doesn't suffer from the same issues that the WoW token plagues WoW with, but that said, I would say there are more frequent whispers from third-party gold-selling websites to contend with. The game also has an impressive free trial that goes all the way to the end of the first expansion, Heavensward, which gives players a more robust first impression of the game. The one thing I will mention is that the cash shop is more heavily used than WoW's shop. You will mostly find cosmetics, but there are convenience items such as story skips as well. The Elder Scrolls Online has the largest variety of monetization practices out of all of these games and can be rather expensive depending on how deep you want to go. To paint the picture, the game is buy to play, there are expansions to buy, there are purchasable DLCs, a cash shop with loot boxes enabled, the ability to convert crowns to gold, and an optional sub fee. Investors asked how they would like to monetize the game, and the ESO team simply said yes. Now, as anyone who plays ESO knows, you certainly don't need to engage with all of these types of monetization. And from my own experience playing the game, if you want a fairly normal level of gameplay, it will cost you about the same amount as other premium MMORPGs. As an example, if ESO was your primary MMORPG, you'd likely buy the game, buy the expansions or wait for them to go on sale at holidays, and pay for the optional ESO Plus sub fee to receive all of the DLC content as a part of that sub fee. This would be on par with WoW or Final Fantasy XIV. My issue with the monetization is that there are a lot of systems there to exploit the whales, and it is difficult to see friends and other players go down the slippery slope. Finally, there is Guild Wars 2. Now, I have not hidden the fact that I think Guild Wars 2 is one of the best value MMORPGs on the market. The amount of content and game time you get relative to the amount of money you need to spend on the game is absolutely outstanding. The game is buy to play with no sub fee, but it does have purchasable expansions and a cash shop. The game is also very reasonable in terms of its free trial that lets players experience a lot of the base game and even reach level cap. Now, there can be some arguments about the cash shop as it does allow players to convert gems to gold. This paired with the fact that many of the most powerful items in the game can be purchased off of the trading post or auction house if you prefer, for gold does raise some eyebrows. However, I think with Guild Wars 2's lack of vertical progression and the ability to make a lot of endgame material pretty easy, this doesn't really become an issue. All this said, I do think New World has a chance of dethroning Guild Wars 2 as the top value MMORPG. It just needs to play its cards right. And there you have it, my thoughts on New World versus some of the biggest MMORPGs on the market today. Now, obviously there's a ton of other comparison points you could dive into, and as I mentioned, this is just really touching the high level of most of these comparisons. What I'd like to hear is your own thoughts in the comments below. Do you have different thoughts than mine, or are there specific comparison points that you think are more important to talk about when talking about New World versus some of these other games? Please consider sharing them in the comments below. Additionally, if you haven't yet, consider liking and subscribing to the channel for more content just like this. All that said, thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.